turn to, sorry, to keep their cameras and mics off. I'd also request our panelists to do the same if they're not currently speaking. If you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. We are also running some polls. The link to those is in the chat as well. We have planned a very engaging evening, and I look forward to your enthusiastic participation. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Sharon Barnhart, Director of Research at the Center for Social and Behavior Change, Ashoka University. She is an applied development economist and behavioral scientist who uses experiments to study policy-relevant topics like sanitation and malnutrition. Sharon started working in India 20 years ago in urban microfinance with women's self-help groups in Karnataka. She has also done research with Seva's BD workers in Gujarat. Sharon is faculty affiliate at JPAL and the Institute for the Study of Labor. She was part of the faculty of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and taught behavioral economics at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. She has a PhD from Harvard University and an MPA from Princeton. It is my honor to invite Sharon to deliver the opening address this evening. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Rangali. And thank you also to Shweta at CSBC, Andy at PCI, and their very involved teams for organizing this webinar and for inviting me. I'm honored, really, truly honored to speak alongside such an illustrious gathering of panelists with such deep experience this evening. And so really, I'd like to just hurry through my comments and get to them. So, I think, their experience and their insights are at the heart of our learning opportunity today, which is really, hearing about the work that they've been doing and the social norms that have been pushed because of that work. Nonetheless, my job is to kind of set the stage for them. So I will do that, but try to do it a bit quickly. So as Rangali mentioned, I'm an academic. So when I think about social norms and I think about women's collectives, I think we have to start by having a common idea of what a social norm is, or at least what's different about them from just kind of collective behaviors. So social norms by definition really involve some sort of punishment, actually. Right? So we think of social norms as informal institutions in parallel to formal laws and regulations. So in the case of formal laws, the government is responsible for enforcement, right, for punishment. But in social norms, we as a society, wherever that society is around the social norm, actually takes on the responsibility for that punishment, right? So we are our neighbors, our friends, our families, our judge, jury, and executioner to what we have as social norms. So similarly, when we think of social norms, we have to kind of differentiate it a little bit from collective behaviors. So an example of this is, we see lots of people doing the same thing. Does that mean is it a social norm, right? And so it really turns on this definition of punishment. So all around me tonight, households are starting to think about what they're gonna have for dinner. And I can guarantee you like 75% at least of households in my neighborhood are making dal, roti, sabzi, rasam, and rice. Right? And it's not because all of those people are going to be punished if they don't follow that pattern, right? It's that pattern just happens to work for all of us, so we all follow it. But it's really not a social norm. It's more like a custom or collective behavior. But when we're thinking about true social norms, there's this element of the other people will sanction us when we deviate from it. So my neighbors, don't really care that much what we eat for dinner and won't try to, make fun of me or shame me if we're feeding our family something different. But if I actually don't send my kids to school, right? Pre-pandemic at least, if I don't send my kids to school, they'll have something to say about that, right? It might be a mild social sanction, it might not be a strong one, but I can expect that if I take that risk, there's going to be some pushback, right? And so that's really like the social norm. All of us are doing something because we know that if we kind of step away from it, that there will be pushback in some form. In some cases, it's a mild pushback. And in other cases, depending on the behavior and how long it's been acceptable in a place, it might actually be a very strong pushback, including involving violence. So that's, thinking about what social norms are. And then when we turn from this, we have to think about what's special about women's collectives, right? And so, as Rangali already mentioned, they come in many shapes and many sizes, and they exist for various purposes, right? So we have beady workers associations, we have the traditional microfinance groups, we now have the government organizing groups to focus on sanitation. And of course, there's also been a large focus on self-employment, entrepreneurship, and many other things, right? So what's special about these tend to be that they're kind of protected spaces prioritizing women's issues, right? So part of it is that there's almost like a certain kind of privacy that's operating in a group, that I can actually talk about what's going on in my household to a greater extent than normally may have been acceptable in the past, right? So that this is separate space where we can talk about what's important to us. And in addition, being in that group confers benefits. Those benefits are often psychological, those benefits are often material, and many times both. But that there's a reason that you would want to stay involved in that group. And that means that the people who are part of a group are actually like, it's a ripe environment to address issues that do actually matter to women. Okay, so now that's social norms, women's collectives, and when we put them together, why is it that these women's collectives might be particularly effective at changing social norms? And for me, it's helpful to think about how norms might be challenged unintentionally or deliberately, kind of over the life cycle of a group. So in my mind, I have this idea that of a group being promoted from outside, right? So like a jivika comes into a village and sets up a group. So if you think about a group that's being promoted in a new place, even social norms about mobility, or perhaps speaking about family issues outside of the family, might be like kind of some weak social norms that have to be confronted. And for many women now, these aren't strong social norms. They can participate in a group kind of freely. But for some women still, these are norms that they might want to wait and see what happens and not actually join the group. So that means a new group, a new collective might actually serve as a screening device that sorts women with the most mobility, empowerment, or ability to take risk and put them all together and get them to interact on a repeated basis on a topic that's of common interest. So this could be really powerful and exciting. And the heart of what's going on here is that you actually have a way to get the right women together, right? And we want to get all women together. We like to have more groups. But what's kind of powerful about having that group start that way with kind of the risk takers is the second thing that I would think about in terms of why these groups might be particularly effective. And that's that those women who aren't able to join a group initially because of the norms or for other reasons, the publicly observable meetings of women happening again and again can change an empirical expectation about behavior, right? So women who go to the groups don't get assaulted. Their families don't suffer when they learn how to start a business and run it. It actually is the opposite, right? So they don't actually learn something new, interact with a man from the promoting organization and run away from an otherwise happy home, right? Simply put, the early entrants are role models, and they can actually unintentionally and passively have a big influence on those who come later and by bringing more people into the system, right? Just by being there and challenging the norms. Third, and here things I think get interesting, is that there's more like intentional defiance of social norms, either from members' own initiative or those that are catalyzed kind of programmatically by organizers. So why would this happen in a group setting rather than by just risk-taking individuals, right? So why don't those, early, risk takers who join the groups first and, suffer take the risk of violating weak norms, why don't they just do these things alone? Why is it more likely in a group? And I think there are two big possibilities. And so the first is that the group can support kind of these trailblazing individuals who take on strong norms. Right? So when we think about norm change, we do have to realize that it's likely that the first women who break a norm will face sanction and will need support. So it's the group, it's especially important when we're coming from outside and trying to change social norms that others face, to recognize that others will need to get support from us, right? The intention of the change and the intention of promoting a social norm and making the groups is to improve women's lives. But these early movers, the trailblazers, may suffer higher costs of defying norms, and they'll need support. And that's actually what the group is good for doing, right? That support group is actually already built in for those norm changers. And then the second also extremely interesting case, and I hope we hear a lot about this from the panelists this evening, is that a group can decide together to try to reshape a norm, right? So a good example of this we might hear about is groups that get involved in domestic violence as a social issue, right? So this really turns women's collectives into collective action by women to get together, find a common problem, and come out with a plan of how to address it. It's this intentional action to reimagine and push the boundaries of society that I think can be particularly powerful and inspirational for all of us. So with that, I'll leave it back to you, Rangali, and to the panelists to tell us what will surely be inspiring stories and insightful learnings from their work. Thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Sharon, for your insightful and eloquent comments. A quick reminder for the audience, there is a link to some polls in the chat. Please do fill them out, and we'll display the results at the end of the session. Our moderator this evening is Andy Bhanot, the Director of Social and Behavior Change Communication at PCI India. He provides overall direction and strategic guidance for developing and implementing social and behavior change interventions to different projects at PCI in India. Over the last 14 years, he has worked in senior roles at BBC Media Action, Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, and ABT Associates, providing leadership to their communication and research programs across South Asian countries. Before that, he worked in the advertising and consumer research industries, directing brand, consumer, and business research for a range of clients. Andy has a postgraduate degree from the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, and professional qualifications in marketing research and big data analytics from the Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and the Great Lakes Institute of Management. It is my privilege to invite him to introduce our esteemed panelists for the evening and kickstart the discussion. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Rangoli. So we have now a good understanding of what today's session is going to unfold. Let me just mute my phone so that there's no echo. Yes. So, talking of collectives, let me begin with a small story. Coming from the Institute of Rural Management, I started my career way back in 1986, working for a dairy cooperative. And dairy cooperatives were really my first-hand experience and peep into women's collectives. So I was interacting with a woman member of the Dairy Cooperative Society from the nomad community in Gujarat called Rabaris. And most of the women who were members of the dairy cooperative, they were paid on a weekly basis for the value of the milk through a small savings account, and the money would directly go into their account. So this woman was very proudly telling me that now she controls all the money, so much so that even her husband has to come and ask her for money for bidi. Bidi is the Indian cigarette that they smoke. So I said, well, that must be a big jump for you, from where you are. So she says, well, not really. I mean, he does ask me for money and sometimes my advice on, feeding fodder to the cows, but I cannot sit in front of him when he's in the home. I cannot sit at the same level as him on the cot. So if I have to sit in front of him, I have to invert the cot. And that is symbolic of the status of women in that society, in the Rabari community. And that set me thinking that, are we really changing social norms in the way that we would like to? But nevertheless, that was a long time ago and things have changed a lot. So I'm indeed very happy to interact with this august panel, the eminent panel, and talk about how can women's collectives speed up the social normative change. We indeed hear a lot about women's collectives, great achievements and the pioneering work done by them. But most of the discussion centers around the achievements in terms of the health outcomes, in terms of the economic outcomes, in terms of the social entitlement outcomes. Very rarely do we get to hear or understand whether social norms have been shifted in the process. And it's very obvious that, to achieve a lot of those outcomes, some norms must have shifted somewhere. So today we have a great opportunity to listen firsthand from people who have led women's collectives, who have worked very closely with women's collectives, and who have a much better understanding of women's collectives. We have an eminent panel of 4 people from different walks, some of them working directly with the collectives and some of them working with international developmental organizations that have worked closely with these collectives. Our first panelist today is Madhu Khetan, who works as an integrator of programs at Pradhan. Madhu is from the 1989 batch of IIM Lucknow, and she spent close to 30 years at Pradhan. And in the course of her work with Pradhan, she spent close to 16 years working with rural communities in Jharkhand and Madhya Pradesh. At Pradhan, she leads pioneering work on gender equality through women's collectives, and she has influenced Pradhan's agricultural approach towards a market-oriented production cluster strategy involving several lakhs of farmers around the production of high-value crops such as vegetables, fruits, and flowers. The strategy has been so successful that it has not only been rapidly scaled up in Pradhan, but it has also been scaled up in collaboration with different state governments in India. It is my privilege to welcome Madhu to our panel. Let me complete the introduction of other panelists. Our second panelist today is Mr. Balamurgan D. from the Indian Administrative Services. Mr. Balamurgan is the Secretary, Rural Development Department, Government of Bihar, and he has the additional charge of the Chief Executive Officer of Bihar Rural Livelihood Promotion Society, also known as Jivika. Mr. Murugan is a graduate in Agricultural Science and Agricultural Management from the Tamil Nadu Agricultural University, Coimbatore, and he has over a decade of experience in the Indian civil services. His rich experience includes governance and administration as district magistrate in the districts of Jahanabad, Gopalganj, Darbhang, Gaya, and Siwan. And he has contributed immensely in the areas of digitizing the social pensions programs and community-led sanitation systems. It is again my privilege to welcome Mr. Balamurgan D. to the panel. Our third panelist today is Madhu Krishna, who is a Deputy Director for Global Growth and Opportunity Division at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. At the Foundation's Office Initiative in India, she leads the initiative on water, sanitation, and hygiene and oversees the gender equality portfolio in India. She manages and supervises a large number of investments under these portfolios and brings them together for sectoral impact, working across technical solutions, policy and advocacy, strategic communications, community engagement, and field implementation at scale. Madhu brings with her diverse experience of over 25 years in a wide range of fields, including private, public, and non-profit sector. Her focus is on program design, evaluation, policy, and advocacy across various initiatives, including sanitation, public health, agriculture, poverty, livelihoods, and women's empowerment. Welcome, Madhu, to the panel. And our last panelist today is Dr. Sharmila Neogi, who works as an advisor for adolescent health and gender in the USAID India Health Office. An obstetrician and gynecologist by training, Dr. Neogi brings over 25 years of experience in conceptualization and management of family planning and reproductive health programs. She has extensive public health experience, having worked with Population Foundation of India as a joint director for programs, HLLF PPT, Family Planning Association of India, and the Marie Stopes Clinics. She also worked on a technical assignment with the Family Planning Division in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. At USAID, she leads the portfolio of gender integrated programming for youth with a focus on strengthening linkages between health and economic empowerment. So welcome to all the panelists, and we are sure that the discussion will enrich our understanding of how the women's collectives create shifts and shaping up of social norms, and how can we mainstream that into the work and into the objectives of women's collectives. So let me kick off the discussion with somebody who works for an organization that arguably can be seen as the one that sowed the seeds of SHGs in India way back in 1986 and 87. So let me turn to Madhu Khetan, and find out from her, in her understanding, how do women's collectives, they work to achieve their overall objectives and program objectives, and in the process, do they shift norms, social norms, And if she can also give us a few examples where social norms have been clearly shifted. Madhu?
Thanks, Andy. And this is something which is very close to my heart. And so very happy to be here. So I think the important role of women's collectives as change agents for social norms and, creating a more just and equitable society is gradually becoming visible as well as recognized. And this phenomena, as Sharon also said, of this process of bringing about, change in societal norms has been happening across the world. It's not a new phenomena, but in India particularly, where we have the world's largest such mobilization of, close to 8 crores women, the potential of this is now very, very evident. And in Pradhan, I mean, where we work with close to 8 lakh women now mobilized into self-help groups, but also larger collectives. We've kind of seen many examples of actually collectives being involved in bringing about change in societal norms. I would like to give a few examples of this. So one, it has been women's acceptance of, domestic violence or public, other forms of violence. And, also there is a very nuanced, the way violence is kind of integrated in the lives of women in various forms. So gradually a greater, appreciation and putting the dots together, we've also seen as kind of collectives mature, as women also build a greater understanding over a period of time. We've seen that happening, and also seen collectives also engaging with the larger societal actors to actually change these informal constructs. There have been various other kinds of avenues like property rights for women, which is again very highly contested in India, despite the the change in the law, but still very few women, and including women like us as well. And so many other areas, women's recognition of themselves as household economic actors, women's mobility, women's rights to equal food and nutrition, taboos on menstruation, women's reproductive rights. So many areas, women in governance forums or Gram Sabhas, etc. But I'd also like to, mention that these changes need intentionality. They do not happen on their own. Just because, we kind of forming collectives with women does not mean that, women together would challenge these norms, because they themselves, all of us, we come from the same society and we've kind of grown up in a particular manner. So, and we carry these beliefs within us. So there has to be intentionality about, raising the discourse and creating conversation around this. I'll stop here.
Andy, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. I have to keep unmuting myself. I forget that. Thank you, Madhu, for reminding me. And thank you, Madhu Ketan, for that very, very lucid explanation. I would now like to turn to Madhu Krishna and try and get from you on what has been your experience of the organizations that you've been working with. And could you also give a few examples where you have seen the women's collectives changing the social norms? And then we will talk a little more about what has been the process of changing social norms. Madhu Krishna, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. As many of you know, for us, really the kind of outcomes that Madhu Ketan talked about and also laid out by Sharon as really important sort of lenses by which we do our work on gender equality. So For us, the framework we follow is that you have to raise women's access, agency, and collective voice. And the women's empowerment collectives are kind of a core pillar for all of our work on gender equality in India. And that started way back in 2011, 2012. Even with the, I would say, much narrower focus at that point of time in the India office, where we were trying to look at some demand side interventions, especially to complement all of the work that we were doing in our health portfolios. And of course, we know that there were very sticky household behaviors that we were trying to change. PCI has been a strong partner for us right from the get-go. But from where we are now today, for me, the SHG platform is in and of itself sort of a manifestation of all of the aspirations that we would like both to embed with women, but also in society itself. So again, it's a very, very important platform for us. And therefore, we have put most of our resources across 6 states now in actually helping and partnering with both the National Rural Livelihood Mission and several of the state missions, with, of course, a big focus with Jivika. And of course, also in UP, because those also happen to be our core focus states for our health programs. What I like to see, and I'm really, really energized about, is this one primary outcome that we see happens even without some great intentionality, but of course we're now seeing a lot of appetite to build that intentionality, is that raising women's own agency and their collective collateral is to negotiate the well-being of their own lives and that of their communities seems to happen over time in the process of collectivization, and of course even bringing awareness around technical agency. The side effect of that is that they understand that they now have a huge collective collateral that they can bring, as many of you have referred to, the safe space to discuss and decide on their own solutions. That's the real outcome, like the golden road that we would like us to have, that it's not top down and driven, but we understand that it's a journey, that we'll have to bring them along and to create this solid platform. So what I'm really most proud of as an Indian citizen and as an Indian woman is that the whole vision for NRLM and this platform is to provide that strong framework and build these community institutions that over time, recognizing that we are coming from a point of where we've been completely disadvantaged as women for many, many centuries, is to provide that platform so that eventually those are owned by the women themselves, for the women, by the women, of the women, right? And they themselves then therefore become strong enterprises, whether it's economic enterprises or social enterprises, agents of social change that they would like, bringing their own groups together and influencing development in a way that makes more sense for them. This bottom-up paradigm is what is very unique about NRLM, both for India and for the world, right? And having said that, we are putting in an extraordinary amount of resource as a government in order to make this platform robust, right? So eventually, the intermediaries should go away, and that the CLFs, the cluster level federations, the community institutions stand up. But in order to just illustrate one point about my first point, that this happens anyway, the side effect, very early on in my journey with the foundation, and even as a consultant, we went on a trip in UP and met with a group of self-help group women, and one of the women stood up, right? And at that point, we'd just done some very basic work on health and nutrition, some, very broad messaging. And she stood up and told us that when I joined, she was about maybe less than 25 years old. She said, when I joined this group at that point of time, and before that, I was a newly married young woman. And if anyone came to the house and knocked on the door, I would say, no one is here. I didn't recognize myself as a person, right? And today I'm standing in front of you, hundreds of you, and talking to you about my experience. And that is what this platform has the ability to do. Because once you do that, then you have unleashed a potential that we all know that all of us as individuals have. So over centuries of time, women have been made to feel that they are invisible, they have workhorses, have to stay in the background, can't stand up, as your story told me about the nomads, that I can't really stand in front of him, right? So, so all along, just by virtue of being member of a group, that provides that unleashing of that potential, right? So That's the side effect of just collectivization and the power of that. Add to that creating an enabling environment, creating and providing skills, whether it's around economic enterprise, around their collective voice, then, I think if we can all put our hands together with this platform, the kind of transformation that India will see will be mind-boggling from the ground up. So I'll just stop.
Thank you, Madhu. Indeed, I completely agree with you. Economic empowerment is just one facet, as Deepa Narayanan of World Bank says, of women's empowerment. The reproductive rights, the ability to decide for herself at various points in her life, the agency to rise up and demand her entitlements, make her own space, are all part of different parts of empowerment. So thank you for sharing your insights there. Let me turn to Mr. Balamurugan B, who heads one of the Navratna BRLPS rural livelihood programs in the country in Bihar. I would like to find out from Mr. Balamurugan what has been his experience leading this change in Jivika, and whether he can now say that Jivika is also, which is considered as a Navratna among the rural livelihood programs, whether Jivika has also set the pace for changing social norms, or is it largely still focused on the economic outcomes, entitlements, and other outcomes? Mr. Balamurugan, please. Sir, can you hear me? We can't seem to hear. Okay, I think he's probably dropped off.
Are you able to hear me, Andy?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Yeah.
A little loud, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. I start where, Krishna was talking, mentioned about this issue of identity to women. My experience, I give one example where I was having my field visit in Purnia. Not exactly for SHG program, that particular field visit for the sanitation program. I was visiting a village and then going to the households and then asking to show me the toilet their perspective. There's a typical, the behavior from those members, those women, those didis, we call them as didis, who are part of SHGs and then who are not part of SHGs. You can, find out.
Sir, sorry, can you come a little closer to your laptop? I am getting requests from the audience that.
Yeah, I think I'll just try to be a bit louder. I think it's better right now.
Thank you.
What I was trying to say is that during my field visit, I could able to see the change, visible change, when I was visiting a household, the way the Didi used to behave with you, not only with you, even with anyone who is visiting the household. She used to come and, say, welcomes you, and then she was not wearing that, mukata.
Gungat.
She's very gungat, and then she will see at your face and then answer you. हाँ सर आइए मेरा शौचालय यही है हमने ये बनाया वैसा बनाया. There's a kind of confidence. That's a major difference. You can see, and then because why I'm saying that, at the same time, on the same day, I visited some other households who are not part of SHG. And of course, I would not say only SHG can bring this kind of a change. Even there are, women who are not part of SHG also having this kind of a capability. But at scale, in general, if you see the members in context of Bihar, I can say there's a kind of change that, SHG, this platform can bring, in women's, lives. That is the most fundamental important thing is, they had their own identity. As Madhu rightly pointed out, previously that was not. I've listened to thousands, hundreds of stories. I should not say thousands because I've interacted with so many Jivika Didis. They all, the most important point they used to come out with, मेरा पहचान बनी है. पहले मुझे उनके पत्नी या उनका माँ जी वैसा ही बोलते थे. Now, right now, they call me as Kiran Didi है. and yeah, Asha Didi hai. So I got my identity. So that is the most important. That comes how it started coming. Actually, as far as this program is concerned, the fundamental objective is to address the issue of poverty, in which economic aspect is more, predominant, but economic and social empowerment. That is a two-liner as far as the objective of this program is concerned. That too for rural households. But we, SRG platform decided to do this work through women, organizing them and then collectivizing them. And the most important outcome of this program is the mobility. They come out. Actually, the basic fundamental requirement. Unless otherwise, the women who don't come out from the home come out in the sense not only physically, mentally also. The physical mobility gives the ability to do other thing also. Coming out mentally, because they get to interact with the other women, they get to see other things, they get to, they get training also. Modular training, though it's all, people can say by giving training you cannot change, but what this program demonstrated is even modular training, capacity building also delivers. It gives results in the long run, not in the short run. Of course, provided all other elements of the program goes on well for a longer time. Actually, Jivika is working for last almost a decade. Previously also, Women Development Corporation was doing a good work in a limited scale, but this program could able to do it at scale because we have more than 1 million SHGs and then 10 million members. They get exposure and then they discuss about their issues and then their ability to interact with the other stakeholders within their home and also outside. For example, their ability to interact with PRI members. They never used to have the confidence to talk to a Mukhya. Right now, they can talk to Mukhya, they interact with PRI members, ward member, and then they can go to block office, and then their ability to talk with other, stakeholders, government officials, even their ability to speak as I can't do that. My Didi can speak like an expert in front of Honorable Prime Minister or CM, Honorable Chief Minister, anyone else. That's the kind of confidence they get. Of course, when I say this, I should also say this. Not all Didis are reaching that, but some of them are having that kind of ability. Many of them, I should say. Again, this program is one of the important, platform, and this is one of the important contributions of this program. And one more important thing I should, bring it on the table is that they are becoming leaders. Not only, members getting, benefits, economic benefits, access to finance. Apart from these things, many of them, thousands of them are becoming leaders. That is also very important. And other important aspect of this program is they see examples from among themselves. They see change among themselves. That gives confidence. But in normal other programs, what happens? You try to show success stories, case studies from outside. But in SRG, in social, this kind of a program, you start seeing results, you start seeing examples, leaders, and then success stories among themselves. That peer learning, and then that gives a lot of confidence. That makes this program as this important indicator of success. And again, these platforms, these SHGs, Vivo, CLF, all these are source of information, knowledge, and knowledge is power. These women, these get power by acquiring knowledge using this platform. It may sound theoretical, but actually it is happening. That is also the elements of this, discussion. I just wanted to bring that also on table. And when I say all these things, of course, you need to have, other aspects working parallelly. For example, government policies. In case of Bihar, there's a conscious policy by Honorable Chief Minister government that you need to promote child's education, particularly girls' education, a lot of policy. And then reservation in PRI, Panchayat Raj institutions, 50% is reservation. And then you have, continuous policy, interventions for dowry and then child marriage and then prohibition. All these things are, you can see these things are also important. I know, again, we should not have this wrong notion that, you can find solutions for all these social issues only through this platform. You need to have other elements also coming, and then only. And but as Madhu said, another speaker also said, this platform is having enormous potential, but all starts with the simple fact that the women would able to get access to finance. That's a starting point, and then that mobility. So I stop here. I'll be very happy to answer other questions also.
I just have a follow-up question, which basically I have been trying to and grappling to understand, and perhaps you can throw some light on that. How have the men folk in the family taken to this sudden avatar of women, their realization of their power, their realization of their identity? So the husbands, the sons, and the fathers-in-law, etc., they still wield a lot of influence, but have they accommodated the rebirth of women in such societies? We still see in many places where the sarpanch is not the husband but the wife, but it's still the husband who does a lot of legwork running around as sarpanch pati or something. So what has been your experience with this power acceptance within the family?
It's a gradual one. I would not say, it happened already. It's all social issues, existing for centuries, thousands of years, I should say.
Yeah.
Takes time, and but I should say this also already there's a visible change. As I mentioned, one of the important aspects is, their ability to have knowledge and then access to finance. All these things are helping them to have that kind of a say. And the acceptance of women, as an equal partner, and also a member who can go out and then can take decisions, it started happening, I should say, and then they started accommodating. I would not say it is 100% complete and then it's all, absolutely fine. But it happened, and I can see that visible change. You mentioned about this Mukhya Pati culture, and there's a lot of difference between what it was a decade ago and right now. Still, a lot of work needs to be done. Still, there's a problem that men try to take decisions on behalf of Didis when they are PRI leaders. So that is there. But as I need to say it in an affirmative way, the change started happening, and men folk started accepting their ability to do all these things. I can give a lot of examples. Didis started, having their enterprises where they take decisions. They go out and they negotiate with other people in business, farming business. And one more example I would like to give you. Under, we have this NRO concept, National Resource Organization. Jivika is NRO.
Yes.
Jivika is NRO, where our Didis who are trained as community resource persons, trained CRPs, they go out to other states, not to other districts. They go out to other states. They go to UP, particularly last few years. They go to Uttarakhand, they went to Assam, they went to Rajasthan, they went to Jharkhand, West Bengal. They supported so many states. Right now, they are supporting UP. And men folk, they come up to, my principal secretary used to give, this example. Pehle, wo Didi bolti, one Didi told him that pehle jo, ठीक आप जाइए बोलता था, अभी वो बस स्टैंड तक मुझे छोड़ने के लिए आता, आप जाके अच्छा से आइए. They go and stay for a month or 2, 60 days. A women from a rural remote village, and they are getting that kind of a support. Without men support, whole family support, that is not possible. They cannot go and stay for 60 days and then 30 days. And within state also, there's a lot of mobility. So I would say it is happening, and it will go in a positive direction.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing those thoughts. Let me turn to Dr. Niyogi, Sharmila Niyogi, and try and understand from her that, is this kind of change also being seen in specific reference to health programs, and particularly for the young people, adolescents, where Dr. Niyogi has worked very closely. Dr. Niyogi? Sorry, you are on mute. Let me see if I can unmute
Yeah,
you.
no, I'm unmuted. I'm sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's really, really great to hear all the panelists and on a topic which is very, very close to my heart. I'm switching off my video. I have some bandwidth issues, so bear with me. Yeah. So at USAID, we firmly believe that gender equality and women's empowerment are not just a part of development, but they are core to the development. So over the time, we have learned that investing in women and girls is essential for transforming communities. And we all know that when women and girls do better, the families do better, communities do better, and the countries do better. So over the past years, talking of the collectives, we have really seen this movement in India, where collective action among women has been really on the forefront. The SDG movement is one of the burning examples of that, and that's actually been the platform for so many different changes at various levels. So we see also that when women collectively act, they often target their actions to redress inequalities in the representation of women and women's interests. Some of the goals towards which we see women actions collectively has been working and reducing incidents of, say, issues like gender-based violence, and also demanding more effective programmatic delivery on core public health services such as water, sanitation, health, food security. And all of this actually requires a shift in norm in some way. So norm shifting, both as our speakers before me have talked, at the level of the community, even for that woman to be taken to a hospital, even for an adolescent girl to walk into a health center without anybody thinking that she has come here for an abortion, or even if she has come for a reproductive health service, not to stigmatize her. So there are biases, there are norms at various levels which impact it, which are extremely deep-rooted in the way we are brought up, in the way, our whole cultural upbringing, and this transcends from the health workers to the community members, to the institutions where these women and girls are going to study, as well as the community. So this requires a norm shift. So I was actually looking through, what are some of the evidences that we have as of now. So I came across very little. I don't know whether Andy, you might have also Googled that. We do have some evidence saying that presence of SHGs at the level of village is associated with higher knowledge of family planning and maternal health services, as well as increase in uptake of service. And this is more specific to rural areas. We also have some evidence saying that that participatory communication programs on maternal child health with women's group improve positive health practices. But there is a need to, these are all limited to small geographies or interventions by some organization. And also, I feel that there is a need to understand this change more fully. We are yet in the process of understanding, because many of these changes are actually, as speakers before me have said, is not intended. We started to do something. We started to make women together. We started to bring girls together on a platform. And what happened as a result of that is, when they came together, they realized that there are some issues in which they can make a change, and it actually maybe change the health now. So those are some of the things which we are still grappling with. And I do feel that, a lot more work is needed there, both in India and abroad. So from our own work, if I were to say, there are, some small examples which we have seen this happening. We've used SHG platforms to kind of capacitate the leaders on the issues of gender-based violence. And we have seen that within these increased capacities, these women and girls actually become change agents and came forward as a collective on the issue, which is which is based on a very deeply entrenched gender norms. I also wanted to highlight, we have the Mr. Bala Subramaniam here. So I wanted to highlight that in terms of our work with the Jivika platform, where we actually use the peer-to-peer human-mediated approach to influence collective social norms, mostly on health issues. And this actually involves the women from the community visually documenting some of the changes that they have made in their lives, and for their peers to identify those changes. And actually, it's important to also relate to those changes. So, and there is some evidence now which we have on, changes which have happened on certain issues such as, improvement in dietary diversity, improvement in spousal communication, contraceptive use, and health and hygiene practices. This work is being now scaled up by Jivika platform in the state of Bihar, and we're also working with 3 other states on this issue. But what I wanted to highlight here is these efforts, again, they are limited and they need more analysis and they need to be, scaled up. I just wanted to bring in the whole context of COVID into this a little bit. The current COVID-19 crisis actually threatens to undo many gains that we have made in women's social and political empowerment. The economic crisis has led to, widespread job losses. It has disproportionately affected sectors dominated by women. We know that women employment fell and many of them have lost their businesses. And women reported higher domestic workload following the lockdown in many studies that we have seen. There is also an impact probably of the return of male migrants to the household, which may further decrease their economy and economic opportunities. But we have also seen that in the wake of COVID-19 also, SHGs have taken on an important role of actually preparing rural India for health crisis and providing important health services. The grassroots movement of women across India have actually gone beyond expectations and sought to fill the gaps where the states have been holding. For example, demanding public goods and provision, and in some cases even taking on delivery of important public services. We see examples of how SHGs have responded by producing millions of masks, sanitizers, PPE, and even basic needs related to girls, such as the sanitary napkins, which actually became unavailable in many places during the lockdown. Importantly, if this collective action among women sustains and this momentum can be maintained, this actually can be channelized to address some of the economic challenges, but also a lot of social norms which are prevailing. This is an opportunity to ensure that specific needs are of the women, of the special groups, especially the vulnerable and the marginalized women and girls, are not lost as we fight this crisis and make our plans. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Niyogi. And I think you very rightly brought in the construct of COVID and COVID-related changes that have kind of crept in. And probably it is the best time to step back, introspect, and see how we can change things from here. Because COVID brought us back to almost, the level of a few years ago in many things. Thank you very much for that very useful insight. Let me turn back to our first panelist who spoke, Madhu Khetan ji. Whether, all these changes that we have discussed and whether we have seen all these changes, and I'm picking on both Sharmila, your and Madhu's point about whether they were intentional or unintentional. So my point is that, did they happen as a part of the pursuit of larger goals of women's rights, entitlements, and empowerment? Or was this an intended planned activity? If not, then is it time, we would like to hear your suggestions and opinions on how norm shifting can now be mainstreamed as a part of regular interventions or regular programs by the women's collectives in South Asia region. So over to Madhu Khetan ji. Madhu ji, are you there?
Yes, yes, Andy. So I think I have a bit of a different opinion when it comes to, our own experience. And so especially when it comes to, deeply embedded beliefs, I think there needs to be an explicit focus. I think when women are organized, there is, of course, a shift in their collective influence and collective power, so to say, which, is manifest in various ways and the kind of, issues that that get taken up. Now, I mean, taking aside the, the romanticism, if I may say so, of that, and to see actually, whether deeply held beliefs, norms, etc. are changing. I think we need to do a clinical analysis of that. Our own, I mean, Pradhan's experience over the last, 35 years of work with women's collectives, we did see that, although there were women as a whole are more empowered, but, we did see many instances of actually, very harmful social norms actually happening to women in groups as well. And these were, some of those were so stark that, and there's some things which are, for example, let me share it because it's a very painful thing, but actually we found that one of the women in the groups, she's actually taking loan for her husband's, second marriage because she's not able to give, a birth to a son. And that's a reality. We usually we would see women in groups taking loans, buying land or some other asset, but who is the land in the name of? Mostly you will find that the land is in the name of the husband. That's been our experience. There may be contrary, experiences also. I do not, of course, I cannot speak for everyone, but that has been, our experience. So in Pradhan's case, we kind of we undertook a systematic, action pilot from 2011 to 2015, which was supported by, Jagori, which is a premier women's rights organization. So both organizations, Pradhan and Jagori, came together to embark on this effort, which was supported by UN Women. And this pilot kind of, threw up lots of learnings for the organization, which then got embedded in Pradhan's mainstream development engagement approach. And we also said that, you can't just preach outside without, also embedding or adopting those things internally in the organization. So actually, we also said that we also have to make Pradhan a more gender sensitive, gender transformative space. So much, so work has happened kind of on both the fronts, I think. Yeah. So I think, and I think NRLM program also, we have the IRMA evaluation in the public domain. There's been another large evaluation done by 3IE. I think the study is, I think, still not in public domain, but the IRMA study, which was, I think, an old study, one must also, accept that. But it did say, if you go through the IRMA study, mostly it does talk about households. And given that, it was done in 2017 and, so when the program was only 5-6 years old, definitely, even to expect those kinds of, outcomes which are more focused on is, but definitely the outcomes are more in terms of economic outcomes. So gradually now we are seeing a shift within NRLM to actually accepting that there is, a separate capacity building effort is required. And we see many pilots happening across various states in that direction. So I think that's the first step of actually recognizing that you do need to make some additions to your regular methodology of, mobilizing and the financial intermediation to actually, embark on advancing more of these outcomes that you want to hope for. I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Madhu. That's again very, very useful. Let me turn back to Madhu Krishna and ask her that now, we have probably a better understanding of how social norms work, both the injunctive norms as well as the subjective norms. And we also have a solid evidence of how the women's collectives have brought about a lot of change in the area of economic empowerment, in the area of entitlements, in the area of, various other sectors that we spoke about, including health. So I would like to hear from Madhu Krishna if, you think that this is the right time to also blend the social normative approach within the work of the organization. if you would also recommend some kind of, analysis, deeper analysis to understand and make sure that it is mainstreamed rather than an unintended outcome, although favorable, but something that happened gradually, by the way, because you were trying to change a lot of things. What's your take on that, Madhu?
Sure, thanks. Actually, I want to go back. Actually, we don't come at it with any rose-tinted glasses. My comment on the norm change or the agency, it was really about just the power of the collective to raise some self-worth and self-identity, right? In fact, it is the foundation which has worked very hard to do that analysis and realize that just because NRLM was looking at economic empowerment of women was not really a gender intentional program to begin with, right? So actually the foundation, through setting up iWage and many other partners, has been working for the last I think about the last 4 or 5 years to embed a very strong gender curriculum in all of the work of NRLM. So we set up iWage, and then through iWage and our support to NRLM. And as Madhu said, one thing we also found that also organizations like Pradhan and many others who were working for women's economic empowerment themselves needed to go through that gender training, including the foundation, right? So it was not only that we didn't have that in our partners, but we also looked introspectively at us. Are we a gender intentional and transformative organization? And are we also doing that? So, of course, we've taken our own journey, what we call a gender integration journey from within the foundation, but also in the program at NRLM. So now, what is really important and what we're seeing, again, to echo what Madhu was saying, is that within NRLM itself, there is a huge curriculum. That means all functionaries, all administrative staff, etc., go through a curriculum at SRLM. It's now being scaled. And a small initiative that we started called the Gender Samvad, because that not only should you sort of do a top-down, but how much listening does the NRLM, SRLM system do to the women and the communities they'd like to serve, has really blossomed just in 2 rounds that we had. The last time we had about 20,000 participants, and the secretary, MORD, and all the mission directors actually sat through that whole consultation where the women spoke of themselves, not necessarily cluster leaders, not necessarily the same usual suspects, but a large range of women spoke about how the program has impacted them, how COVID has impacted them, what they'd like to see. So I definitely don't believe that we have any illusions that we are going to change gender norms just because we have a program like NRLM. All I'm saying is that the platform and the collectivization provides us with a very strong framework, and that this journey can take much more, rapid steps rather than going group by group, geography by geography. The framework, the more we do, the more we build up those community institutions and continue to play on some of those. Now, even if you're looking at health, which is where we have a strong partnership with PCI, that those, even the 5-point difference in difference is something we were not able to achieve in 40 years with all of the supply side, because those are really household behaviors. What people feed their children in the household is not something that a health department functionary, no matter how close she is to the community, whether it's an ASHA worker, can do, until all of the women decide that this is something that is beneficial, and over time it becomes a sticky social norm, right? That, okay, yes, when the child is born, after 6 months, we have to start doing complementary feeding. We have to have some kind of dietary diversity. When there's a pregnant woman, she needs to get this, right? So those gatekeepers, those influencers, because we know currently our SHG women are not of that, our target audience range, right? There's a little bit older. Maybe they already have a couple of children, and some of them may be mothers-in-law, but they're very important influencers. And that's how social norms change, right? Because you have a larger set of influencers who decide, and there is some sort of, as Sharon said, there's some sort of compliance monitoring. Is everybody doing it? If your child is weaker, then that's because you're not following everyone's social norm. And so she can be held up to some kind of peer pressure or some kind of peer compliance, right? And that's when it will happen. But to get to that stage will obviously require a lot of messaging, will obviously require a lot of targeting. All I'm saying is going household to household, which is what the SHGs do, versus having a collective voice and then everyone sort of validating your decision. So if you're an outlier and you say, oh, I read somewhere on Mobile Vani that there is this message that talks about how I should treat my child, I'm not an outlier because I have the voice of the collective with me. At least in my village, all the women are doing it. So tomorrow in your village, you should also do it because this makes sense and we are seeing this difference. So that's the point I was making. And really on the gender intentionality, I mean, we suffer from those gender barriers today, right? I mean, why is a woman looking at a mobile phone? There's a lot. We try and push, so much digital content, but when BBC Media Action did for us a huge analysis, we saw the huge gap. Even if the phone is in her name, does she have access? I know for a fact that many of them, because of COVID, have actually surrendered those phones to children who are going to school and need those for online classes. So they're back to either zero phone or the brick phone. So even if programs have given them that value. So, and to the next, I mean, I think you touched on an important point on men's involvement. I think in the first instance, we heard many times that women are subject to violence if they go out for the first couple of times to the meetings. It's only when, I'm sorry to say, when the selfish angle kicks in, that going out by the woman accrues some additional household income or some economic benefit or some sort of status that, okay, oh, your wife is a community leader, that the men start cooperating. Over time, as younger men start seeing this is the norm, that, okay, my mom goes out, my wife should go out, will the actual norm change happen? It is going to be a generational shift. What I think is really the next step for us also is to try doing these mixed adolescent collectives so that this gender embedded differences start being addressed right from a young age, right? And in the urban areas, we have many partners who've done that quite successfully, right? So the boys already know about menstrual hygiene, even as teenagers. They're told about it. It's a normal bodily function. There's no taboo. And young people can then influence their own families because their voices, they can actually call out bad behavior, right? So if for them it's a norm, that, okay, this is a norm. This is what all teenage girls go. This is not something to be ashamed of. There's no taboo, but get them young. And I think in rural areas, that's the next thing that we need to do, is to create strong groups of adolescents, because finally it's their world. Now, whether it's climate change, whether it's gender equality, whether it's COVID impact, they have to design and reimagine a better world. So let's not let them come back, get ingrained with these bad barriers and bad norms, and then try and shift them. So can we do that early on, is what I would say.
We need more Malalas and more Greta Thunbergs to push the change. Well said.
You can see that lone voices don't work. Supposing they were behind a strong, world collective of young voices, maybe would have seen more thumping of tables than just one person trying to do it alone.
No, but it's beginning to happen, and it's very interesting that you say that. We are also implementing a program to involve men in some blocks of Samastipur, and we are trying to educate the audiences about the concept of financial planning, and in the process, we are also telling them about family planning. And I found a very interesting episode when traveling to the rural areas. One of the women said that, it's her mother-in-law who is encouraging her to go and attend that financial planning course, saying that don't worry about household chores, I'll take care of that. You benefit from this program because we need this more than, the daily things that I can do. So yes, it is, as you rightly said, it is beginning to shift. It is slow, but now that we have a good understanding of the intersectionality of the programs and the gender lens and the gender transformative view, I think we should try and leverage that. With that, let me turn to Mr. Balamurugan once again and ask him that, if there is a better understanding of how gender approaches can be built into the mainstream programs, and if there is a better understanding of how social norms work, what would be his ask as, somebody who's running these programs in a very successful organization? What kind of gender transformative lens would you like to build into your programs? Mr. Balamurugan? Sir, can you hear us?
Yeah, I just lost you. Can you just come back again, Andy?
Yes, I'm saying that, now we seem to have a much better understanding of how social norms work, the subjective norms and the injunctive norms. We have also seen that the programs automatically have started changing the norms or pushing the envelope in different ways. If we want to consciously take a very gender transformative lens for our programs, as somebody who has been running these programs for years, what would be your advice or what would be your ask? How would you want to rebuild or refocus your programs with a very specific gender lens?
Very difficult question, but I would like to, very frank in answering this. For
Yes, sir.
example, when programs are designed and working for last 10 years, they work in a particular fashion. For example, the core capacity of that particular program and staff, entire system would be of that nature. And when we started this program, it is, as I said, and both Madhu, Krishna and Ketan were also mentioning, I completely agree with whatever they said. One of the important objectives is to address the issue of poverty through women, and particularly the focus is on households. And most of the outcomes as far as normative changes are, unintended, I would say, starting with mobility and other things. And we consciously, of course, gender is very important agenda starting from beginning. But the focus is on forming groups, training them, financial inclusion. That is a fundamental, very important objective. So the staff and everyone is trained towards that particular, way. And when we started talking about gender issues, I need to state first the challenge is, within at every level, SPMU, we should start believing, these things can happen, should happen. And so the challenge, and then what we are trying to do is, we are having partners. So the first is to orient the staff and, officers within the Jivika about gender sensitivity, gender issues. Though they are working towards it, but you need to have a nuanced understanding about these issues. So that is one, that is how we are seeing, and then we started, and it's going to be very, challenging, and then it's going to be a long journey. It cannot happen by giving one training. These are all very, very, nuanced issues, and then existing for a long time. Some people having their own conviction and then understanding. By giving training, it's not going to change. But of course, we need to continuously work on this. So gender as an, obvious agenda is being introduced, and then that's how it started. We started giving training and then making them to understand about these issues, first at staff level and then at every level. So this is how we started, and it's going to be this way only. And again, I don't want to, I just want to be very cautious about it. And we cannot just plug and play everything. And some of the normative changes, gender issues can happen, in a slow, gradual manner as, outcomes of, major program. It's not as in a direct, you cannot change things by, okay, we'll address the issue of, violence against women, will, run programs for 2 years and that will be addressed. Of course, we should take it as an important agenda that is discussed, but these things are going to be, long-term objectives, and it will gradually happen. That is my understanding. That's how the programs are, though we are introducing the agenda, gender-related agenda, be it child marriage, I mentioned about those things, they are being taken up, but largely the program will be focusing on, economic agenda, and these agendas also will be taken up parallelly, and then that will be, and one more important thing which we are doing, and that is how I'm saying in, for next 10 years, 20 years in a sustainable way, introducing this agenda in CLF and then VO. At community level, CBOs, particularly at CLF level, so that that will stay with them, and then there's a sustainability. And I've just wanted to, mention some of the observations in the chat box. I agree with most of the observations. It's not, by sending someone, few didis traveling to other states for economic opportunity cannot be treated as normative change. I completely agree with, but it was they were not even having that kind of a capability. From there, it started happening. We should understand this also. We cannot, expect everything to change in a period of 5 years, 10 years. These programs, these changes will happen. I firmly believe, and it will take another, we need to work on this agenda continuously for another decade or two. Then only we can, see sustainable changes. So that's what I wanted to say. I stop here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Alamuddin, for that very insightful comment. Let me turn to Sharmila and picking on Madhu's comment, about recommending more adolescent self-help groups or more adolescents coming into it. Sharmila, do you see that as something that will speed up the process, that will bring about more normative change? Plus, it will also include the gender transformative angle into a lot of work that the SHGs are doing, self-help groups are doing?
Absolutely. Actually, I completely agree with all the speakers before me. Norm change is a slow process. If you really want to change norm at the individual level, it really takes a generation to do so. Having said that, it's not that we only have to look at the slow process. We also have to look at some of the low-hanging fruits and how to shape those norms through them. So this is something which at the USAID we have realized that we have to do this very early on. So which is why a few years ago, I mean it was not existing before that, we started this adolescents and young people portfolio. So before that we did not have that, because we realized to do anything in this country, you will need to engage with them, because they are going to shape the future. They are the ones who need to, change their behavior. They are the ones who need to practice healthy behaviors. So we've done quite a bit of work in the past few years, and some of the learnings are what I wanted to share with you. And these learnings are actually coming through the voices of civil societies, the collaboratives that we have helped shape, as well as the adolescents and youth themselves. So one of the things which they all agree is that, for the programs to do any changes, they need to be there on that program. So they are voices, and usually they come in the form of collectives. I mean, we do have, this groups at the level of the villages, which our programs have mandated to be built. But wherever we have seen there is a good civil society organization actually working with this group, we have really seen a lot of change happening there. In some places, I mean, it's very differential. If you look at how the youth groups are functioning, some places they only exist for namesake. Whereas in some places, we see that actually they have gone to influence behavior from young people to the older generations, both at the household level and at the community level, be it for the issues of the girls' education, their skilling, that the stopping of early marriages. This kind of examples we have seen a lot in our book. The other part of it is relating more to the adolescent girls, what I am saying. Whereas the behavior of the society and the community and the families have to change, and especially the males, both when they are boys and when they are men, need to be brought into the program. I think one of the things which is extremely important is they have to see the value of this adolescent girl within the family. Otherwise, in the Indian context, what largely happens is when she is looked at as a liability and not as an asset, there is more likely that, she will be dropping out of education. She will be, and education doesn't sometimes give you those skills for which you can either get a job or go to the next level. So I think I'm just highlighting the importance of skilling and bringing adolescents together. We see even small digital literacy programs, I mean, they work magic when you look at, groups of adolescent girls who have benefited from that. But again, I'm repeating, these are all islands of excellence. They are happening in many places, and they need to be, I think various players need to come together to support this program and support them long term, because no norm change is a 1 year, 2 year business.
Correct.
So that's something I wanted to specifically highlight, and it's actually important to bring their voices to the corridors of the policymakers, as well as to the communities from which they come from, because they are the ones who are actually telling you whether the programs you are designing, whether the interventions you are doing for them is actually benefiting them. We may be thinking very nice. I mean, just to take the examples of some of the services that we provide for adolescents through government sector sometimes. They don't achieve the purpose that we intended them to achieve. They are there and they exist, but then they are really not, if you want to say in terms of friendly to what their needs are. So I think their needs have to be kept in forefront, and they need to be brought on board with some of the practices, some of the issues on which norm change. If the girl herself believes her to be kind of a liability and somebody who is to be married off at the when she attains age, then that's not going to change anything. I think she has to believe, the community has to believe, and it involves work at all levels. And I think in this country, we have to utilize all the opportunities that we get to address these issues.
Well said. Thank you so much. I'm conscious of the time, so we are probably coming closer to the end of this discussion. We may have a few more minutes. Let me just go back to our first panelist, Madhu Khetan, and ask her, as a program manager, what kind of programs would she like women's collectives to be implementing in the coming years? And what kind of policy environment would be conducive for women's collectives to accelerate and strengthen the area of shifting or reforming social norms in the coming years? What would be her advice to newer organizations entering the space or practitioners of social norms and those working in the space of women's collectives? Madhu Khetanji, are you there?
Yes, Andy ji. Yes. So I think as program manager, one big shift which I think is required, and it's a difficult shift, which Madhu Krishna also mentioned, and all of us kind of talk about it, but I've seen also within Pradhan, which is because of the virtue of being a civil society, allows for more flexibility. Even there, it becomes so difficult, is that collectives becoming more bottom up and functioning in a manner that they can respond to members' issues rather than being driven from the above, directions or instructions from above. Now that it's easier said than done, Andy. So that's one, because unless that sensitivity is there, and also not just sensitivity, but it also requires other things to be there. It requires resources to be within your disposal, etc., so that you have actually the freedom to pursue objectives that you set for yourselves. But that is one, and our general instinct is to to kind of direct and influence and whatever. So and also as we also have a tendency to also look up to power, caste, class, caste, etc. And so there is that kind of power inequalities which kind of tend to make organizations more top down rather than bottom up. So how do you kind of let the controls go, or at least go down to some extent? That's one. The other thing is that women's collectives, as all the speakers are saying, that they have to be imagined in their broader construct of, although as Balaji said, that primarily the agenda is an economic agenda, which all of us agree. But how can the economic agenda be also transacted in a gender transformative manner, so that the kind of changes that we are seeing are actually are designed or built into the processes, and we kind of don't assume, because otherwise like the Green Revolution is a classic example that all of us know, and in Punjab what it did to women's position. So that the economic agenda is not agnostic of what it is doing to women's position, both within households as well as within society. That has to be we have to really think around that, so that the economic agenda also leads to a transformation in women's position. And in that context, I think we have to we have to really mull over the agenda for the women's collectives, that, what is the specific role that women's collectives need to play beyond, financial intermediation, or even within financial intermediation. For example, this question of, giving out loans for assets or land, buying land, but the land itself is, in the name of the husband. So we have to see how we can, actually integrate. The example of the Seva Bank could be a case in point where, the organization, it's focused on a particular service, but that service is, is done with a very, very sharp gender focus. So that's one. And in terms of the policy environment, I would say there are 2-3 issues, and I'll take some 2-3 minutes to just share those points. One is that these collectives are in a very unique space. They are neither for-profit organizations, nor are they only for societal goods. They're typically not for-profit organizations. So they are basically advancing their members' rights, which may be economic or, maybe social, or even vis-a-vis, their rights vis-a-vis the state, etc., while also advancing community interest. Now, this, if you look at this, there is no appropriate form of registration that recognizes this kind of unique space that these collectives have come to acquire. Neither the Societies Act, which is, basically for greater societal good, nor a cooperative societies framework, which is, basically members producing and then kind of, and nor a trust. So what probably comes closest is a trade union, but again, there are lots of differences with that construct as well. So one important policy issue is that we do need an appropriate legal framework. In the absence of that, we are kind of registering them as, either Societies Act under Cooperatives Act. In different states, different approaches are being taken. The second thing is that we need a financing framework for these collectives to continue to exist or operate for members' benefits, and to work on the agenda of social change, which requires, changing social norms. Now, that's at the heart of, collectives, which is a women's collective. Now, but changing social norms is in the nature of a public good. And therefore, public good is, basically state has the primary responsibility, for a public good. So therefore, if CLFs are working as partners of the state in, in delivering on public goods, then meeting their costs should be a part of the state budget. And it would be in the interest of the state to continue to support the women's collectives or federations. Now, currently it is happening, but, there is always this kind of, thing in the backdrop that one has to, make these organizations financially sustainable. I mean, I have no problem with operationally sustainable, but, so we have to be very clear about the financing framework, because otherwise, there are different kinds of demands that keep coming at various points of time. So, so there could be 2 scenarios. I mean, one is that, the state continues to support. The second scenario also is, that if the state is saying that, we're also seeing that, when it comes to building or mentoring large organizations, typically the state has kind of played the role of an administrator, but not really the state, the role of actually creating these large organizations, because large organizations tend to be more complex entities to promote. So for example, taking the example of the 10,000 FPO initiative, wherein, the state has taken a particular role, but there are agencies, specialized agencies, which have been roped in to actually play various kinds of roles. So we could, we could think of a similar policy framework if we are saying that, if there are issues in the first scenario where the state itself is kind of, we could think of, also kind of bringing in a policy framework where we kind of also rope in other actors to actually mentor and support these organizations. And of course, person power framework, it's a smaller issue, but we do need fresh thinking on this. Currently, my sense is that the need for, person power at the CLF level is not adequately recognized. And it is, now agreed upon, but different states are, still, not on one page. So I think collectives continue to be a little undernourished and undermanaged because of lack of adequate person power at the CLF level. They may have lots of cadres, but not really managers, so to say. So yeah, so I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharp, once again. Let me turn to Madhu Krishna ji and ask for her reactions to what Madhu Ketan said. Do you sort of, see agreement here, or do you have something to add, or you have something different, both in terms of the programmatic focus as well as the policy changes or policy environment?
Yeah, so, a lot of what Madhu says resonates. I also am a big believer, Andy, in affirmative action. Yeah, finally, somebody has to cede power for another one to get equal power, right? Whether we talk in the geopolitical space, or we talk in family, or we talk in society, men have to step back. They have to step back and make the space for women to step up. So if you're 9 men in a conference and there's 1 woman, is that fair? So 4 men have to step back, right? And say 5 other women have to come. Let's just recognize that that will happen. It will cause major disruptions. It will cause minor and major disruptions. If there are enough people in society who believe that that's fair, that it's unfair that 9 men are in a board and only 1 woman, then 4 men will have to step down, right? And currently also in every sphere of life, if there are bankers, if there are banking agents, if ration shops were all owned by men and they have to be now owned by women, someone has to step back, right, to make that space. So, and therefore we have seen that causes disruption, whether it is affirmative action in the US or quota systems here, they do cause disruption. Over time, history tells us that does reduce hugely the gender gap, society gap, Dalit gap, whatever be the gap that you're trying to do. So I'm a big believer in that. And until we are very realistic about that, we are never going to solve it by softly saying, okay, yes, let's get, I said, yes, we should get adolescents. It should become the norm in their behavior. That means they also need to know that girls and boys all have to have equal space. It can't be good that there are 9 people who are of one gender and only 1 person, and her voice is drowned out, right? And then I'm not even going to where the other genders are because they have no voice at all, even in my description, right? So I just feel that having that space, making that space is the ground reality. Are government programs doing enough? I think they're at least trying to do that, right? By setting up, whether we look at our urban examples where, they've said in Odisha, for instance, that all public municipal services will be handed to SHG enterprises. There's a political reason to do it, right? You don't have to justify, you don't have to go through RFPs, you can just simply do sole source contracting. But there is a good intent there. Similarly in UP, now similarly here in Bihar, we are seeing a lot of this thing happening. Is it happening in the private sector? Not at all. Yeah, you can see India today, page after page of their conclaves, 3 women, 50 men. Powerful list of powerful people in the country, 3 women. 50 powerful women, 50 powerful people. They just issued a thing. Go and count the number of women in that. 3. 3 out of 50. Yeah, and that doesn't strike anyone who's reading it, largely all the men, as something that's extraordinary. So my thing is, this is not just about SHGs. This is not about that. At least is a big investment. Big investment. Amount of money that's rolling into that. From the government, I actually have very little to complain. We have to provide the right technical assistance, yeah, but we don't have that in the private sector. So the society is not just made of government programs, right? Norms are not just going to be shaped because NRLM behaves in a certain way. Every single one of us is shaped by the society in which we live, and the private sector is not shaping up at all. There's no shift, there's no discourse. There's one Cadbury ad and we're all going gaga over it on social network. Yeah. What about the other 6,000 ads which show women washing clothes and, or sitting in the kitchen? Trying to be a superwoman. Yeah. Or, yeah. So I'm simply saying, why lump all of this only on the government? They are doing their bit. What are we doing? Are we raising our voice? Are we saying that? Because this session is about social norm. It's not about NRLM. It's about women's collectives. I agree, but collectives are born out of these barriers. The men who support those collectives or are anti those collectives are shaped by norms that we create, and we let them stick because we don't fight back.
True. Spoken from the heart. I could sense the passion in your voice. Thank you so much. Let me take the final word from Mr. Balamurugan, because somebody running the program at such a large scale, what kind of challenges do you see in a lot of these discussions that have happened, and what's your advice for mitigating some of those challenges? Mr. Balamurugan, sir, can you hear us?
Yeah, thank you. And the challenge is, the danger is also trying to overload the platform.
Yes.
That is actually, see, it's 10 years is not a big period. For example, I would talk about Jivika. The what is happening? This is very important, very powerful platform, but doesn't mean that you can overload this platform with so many things. So that is one challenge we face. And again, I said mostly this platform would be concentrating on addressing the gender issues through economic empowerment, but sometimes the focus shifts entirely towards economic. Not focusing on people think that the institutions we have already invested enough in strengthening the institutions. Not. It's just a beginning. My understanding and then firm belief in this program is we should focus on strengthening institutions, that is VIVO and SHG, starting from SHG, VIVO and CLF. And CLF as a governing institution, and Madhu Khetan spoke about it. There's a legal status which is being given in Bihar. They are getting registered as cooperative societies under Cooperative Act. And as far as Bihar is concerned, I can affirm what Madhu's, I can tell this, that we are making enough provisions for to have good seed money, and then also provisions for managerial positions for governance issues related to CBO, because these are all the institutions which is going to exist. So we need to keep focusing on strengthening these institutions at least for another decade, or at least for another 5-6 years. Then only all other initiatives will fall flat, unless otherwise these things are not taken care of. This foundation for this entire program is this IBCB, I would say, and also the immediate realization of finance, that is financial inclusion. These two components. Other things some of the things happen simultaneously. That is one. And fortunately, as far as Bihar is concerned, there's a absolute support from highest level from Honorable CM. There's understanding, and as Madhu was mentioning, a lot of political decisions also. For example, in case of Bihar, there's a decision to start give canteens, cabinet decision to hand over all the hospital canteens to Jivika Didis. We have Didi Ki Rasoi, and then same way uniform stitching, and then all the newly constructed ponds for fishery purpose and for maintenance purpose also is being handed over to CBOs. So such policy decisions are being taken, but these things are to be taken because you need to have the capacity also to handle all these things.
Correct.
It cannot happen in a single day. So that is my take, and I'm confident with the present set of, though you have challenges, but I think this program is going to go in a long way in addressing all the issues, normative issues, social issues. But having said all these things, I should say we should have patience, and this platform alone cannot solve all the problems. It's going to be other factors kicking in and then playing their own role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Very well said. Dr. Sharmila Neogi, any last words from you? Any last words of advice or any reactions to what has just been discussed, both from the programmatic perspective or policy perspective?
Yeah, I just wanted to make 2 points. I mean, we're very much in agreement with what Madhuji said, both the Madhujis said. I just wanted to bring here that, those norms, I mean, if we let alone the example of collectives, a lot of norms, even among the educated have not shifted so much. I mean, if I just look at medical professionals, how many men go into gynecology versus women, and how many women go into become surgeons and orthopedists? So if you look at that numbers, those numbers are still not very high. When I was doing my graduation, I mean, it was something, males going into gynecology was something which was not accepted. It is now. People do go, but what I'm trying to say is still the change is very slow. And then how many women end up going to those doctors in the states of UP and Bihar if they practice there is another thing. So this is just a different example. So my take is, I know we all have to do our bit. So what do we do as development professionals who are in this field and who are, in the midst of this movement, and we are trying to, make this work for the women. I think one of the things which we are trying to do is do a lot of integrated programming at the level of USAID. But having said this, integrated programming is extremely difficult from the point of view of matrices and measures. How do you measure that change? And secondly, no donor or no institution is going to have so many focus areas that, if you just look at youth, if you want to really support youth, I mean, you can't just do SRH with them. SRH is an important aspect of their life. You also have to do, the norm change work. You have to do skilling. You have to work on their employability. You have to work on life skills. I mean, you have to work on other aspects of their life, such as nutrition and the way their girls are valued by their families. So these are so many different aspects. So no single program can support it. So one of the things which I do feel is we all need to also strategically, do a lot of research on this and find out what are those nudges that we need to build on. And secondly, we need to come together as a community which has government, corporates, and the donors, and even the community, most importantly, because each of us bring in our different strengths, and those different strengths in many cases are extremely complementary to each other. So how do we do that? How do we bring all that strengths together and learn? This has been an important lesson for us, and which is why what we are trying to do is, catalytic programming, where we are actually working with a lot of other donors and, other institutions to look at innovative ways how we can address this problem. Because to us, these programs are demonstrating that integrating these issues and addressing these deep-rooted gender norms and health concerns with women and girls builds on the collective action, and it actually goes a long way in empowerment of the next generation.
Thank you, Shamila ji. Thank you very much. I really am very reluctant to end the discussion here and let go of this, but there is a time for completing pressure to complete the entire discussion and panel discussion on time. So I'm going to turn to Rangoli and see if there is space or time for any questions. I see a lot of chats have already happened, and some very interesting points have been raised by Ragini, which I can trust her to do, knowing her very well, and some very interesting points made by Mahua also about Sabina Khatun and her story. So let me turn to Rangoli and see if we have time for one or two questions, or should we circulate the answers later on to the emails. Rangoli, over to you.
I think we have time to take one or two questions.
Okay, so would the audience want to ask a new question, a different question, or should I invite anybody from the panel to respond to the questions that are already there or the chat that's been going on? So if anybody has a question, you can please raise your hand and we can take one or two questions. We just have time for one or two questions. Rangoli, if you see any hands raised, please do let me know, because I can see only your face.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have any questions, it's absolutely fine. But I would just open up the floor and invite any panel member, because some of the points that have been raised in the chat box are very important, and they would definitely add to the variety of the discussion that we've seen here. Would anybody like to respond to any of the points? I see both Madhus have already responded, but please go ahead if you want to. Madhuji.
Just like to add a point also that, we kind of also, which I wrote in the chat, just like to elaborate. So we also, kind of, when we talk about women collectives as agents of change, etc. But, also recognizing that services are equally important. And, immediately when you talk about, issues of gender, so we've seen that, immediately surfacing of violence, etc., becomes, starts happening. But we've also seen a dearth of, actually services available to actually support women. So legal services, counseling services, and, actually a responsive, police system, etc. So all that also, I think, so along with, so we have to have a more comprehensive framework. So one is individual, but also, institutional and material framework to also change social norms.
Completely agree. Any other perspectives? Anybody would like to respond to any of the comments or points discussed in the chat box? Great. I think this has been a perfect discussion, and I'm glad that, we not only got to understand so many rich perspectives, but we also managed to finish it on time. So I once again thank all the panelists for those wonderful insights and the perspectives, and also thank all the audiences that were so engaged and asking those sharp questions and continuing the momentum in terms of the question answers from the audience side. Thank you once again. Over to Rangoli Gupta.
Thanks, Andy. I think we've all experienced the power and the potential of doing things together at some point or another. And I think our conversation today has only reinforced that truth. I would like to thank all our panelists for their thoughtful commentary and nuanced analysis of women's collectives as agents of norm change. And if we could, let's share the results from our polls. Anushka?
Yes, just
So are some of these results pre-discussion and post-discussion, some kind of a comparison, or have they been throughout the discussion?
They've been running throughout, but I think that's
Okay.
actually something we'd like to hear from the audience.
All right. So is Anushka going to share some results?
Yes.
The Mentimeter? Okay.
Can everyone see the result?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yeah. So I think we've got some interesting results. And like Andy said, we'd love to know what if this was pre-discussion, what if this was post-discussion, because I think we've discussed that women's collectives are poised to be critical to norm change in South Asia. And we'd love to know how that thought process has evolved for our participants through this evening. This is the last question. We will be sharing these results with everyone over email. And in the interest of time, I would like to invite Sushmita Mukherjee from PCI India to deliver closing comments. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Rangoli. It was actually a wow deliberation today. So on behalf of the South Asia Learning Collaborative, I would like to propose this vote of thanks. And I'm sure the audience and all of us really enjoyed not only listening to the experts, but also learning a lot from them, their experiences about the functioning of self-help groups, the women collectives, their role and experiences in shifting social norms. We learned the potential of women's collective and the journey to unleash that potential. And Rangoli, you were brilliant in setting the tone at the beginning of the thing. So thanks a lot to you. In order of sharing of the experiences, let me start thanking Sharon Barnhart first for her keynote address and initiating the discussion about women coming in collectives, talking about the issues and norms that affect their lives, and feeling that this is the right platform to do so. I would also like to thank Madhu Khetan for sharing her experiences on how SHGs have been engaging with shifting norms, her experiences from Pradhan. I do recognize when she said that organizations themselves need to mainstream gender within themselves before they take it out for others. And thanks for bringing that up, and also for talking about the need of sustainability of these collectives. I would like to thank Madhu Krishna ji from BMGF to start about talking of need of a framework that Foundation has, which focuses on raising women's agency and collective voice to negotiate the well-being of their own life and community. Thank you, Madhuji, for sharing how SHGs are a great starting point for this journey towards transformations of social norms. It was great to hear about the collectives with a mix of adolescents as well, as I'm a big fan of working with adolescents, and we need to start early in our efforts for addressing the gender barriers. Of course, it was a great delight to listen to you, Dr. Balamurgan D. Sir from Jivika. It was great when you said that women now could talk confidently with men getting out of their veils. This is a big change we all are experiencing. I really acknowledge when you say that women have learned to recognize and gain their own identities. SHGs definitely have become a big platform to facilitate and give the opportunities to women to talk to not only within themselves, but also to other stakeholders, really understand those power dynamics and negotiate their spaces. This platform is also nurturing them as leaders. That was great to listen and learn from you, sir. It was great to hear from you the role of family, the engagement of men, and how you have observed that, yes, family has a big role. The power shifting is happening, although it's a gradual process. I would like to thank Dr. Sharmila Neogi from USAID as well. Gender equality is definitely core to the development, ma'am. Sharmila ji did emphasize in this webinar on the need for scale of these efforts. I would like to specifically recognize she mentioning that amid the COVID-19 pandemic, SHGs have done a great job just beyond expectations, including delivering important public services like making masks, making sanitary napkins available to adolescent girls as well. We all agree to her that this momentum needs to be maintained, and all of us from different backgrounds, personal, professional, all need to come together to keep it up. And the need of special groups should not be lost here. And maybe SHGs have a great potential to take care of that as well. I would definitely like to thank Andy for the brilliant moderation and ensuring that the different dimensions are being called out from all these experts, and the learning is being enriched today for the audience. Of course, this webinar could have not been possible without the behind the stage efforts by the teams from PCI and CSPC. So I would like to thank Shweta and Anushka from CSPC, Sarmishta from PCI, and of course, again, the leaders behind Indrajit and Pawan from PCI and CSPC, who have been a great inspiration and encourager to the entire team. So thanks to all of you. And last but not the least, I would like to thank on behalf of all of us here, all the women members of self-help groups, women in any form of collectives, and individuals as well who are leading, supporting, encouraging the efforts to bring a change in the social norms, in the gender norms, to create a more gender equitable society. Let's continue to make this platform stronger and stronger. The journey has just begun. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushmita, for your excellent summary. And finally, I would like to extend my gratitude to our audience for joining us today. It is sessions like these that reaffirm the SA-SNLC's conviction that these are conversations worth having. And if you would like to be kept apprised of future events hosted by the collaborative, please consider joining us. The link to register is in the chat, and I hope to see many of you in future sessions. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rangoli, for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.